debt has to go up, or we have to create the same amount of money and distribute it as a dividend. And that will give us all something of a basic income. That particular year, the dividend amounted to $7,500 per person and to $30,000 per family. Now that may not have been enough to survive on, at least in some areas, but it would have been a big help. I'm not saying that you could totally abolish all forms of social security with that, but it would go a hell of a long way towards it and make it easy for everybody. And nobody gets taxed at all to pay the national dividend, and nobody goes into debt for the national dividend.
My name's William Waite. Today I'm here with Charles Pinwell, who I've known for 20 years, and we're going to be talking about this idea of a national dividend. Chaz, would you like to kick us off?
If you like, the first thing we should do is try to give a good understanding of what a national dividend is. What is this concept of a national dividend? All dividends are a distribution of profit. Companies distribute corporate profits. They have to have a profit before they can pay a dividend. And to have a national dividend implies that a country is profitable. Now, one of the difficulties with this is that you can look through all the multinational companies you like, all the national companies, all the entities you like, whether they're trusts or charities or what, and they all do comprehensive accounts. They do balance sheets to work out what their assets and liabilities are, and they do profit and loss accounts to work out what their production is and how much it cost them to produce it. But there are 195 entities on earth that never do balance sheets and never do profit and loss accounts. Well, they never do comprehensive balance sheets, we could say. They do partial ones. And they have all got something in common. They're all nations. Nations are not interested in what their assets and liabilities are, apparently, and they're certainly never ever done profit and loss accounts. So before we're going to pursue the idea of whether a national dividend is a good idea or it's possible, we have to know whether our countries are profitable. And we have done a profit and loss account for the United States, and it showed us that the total income of all American citizens, all added together, came to 10.1 trillion, and the consumer products produced and sold were 12.5 trillion. So we definitely had a profit there of 2.4 trillion of consumer products above consumer incomes. So what we're talking about is distributing that fairly on the basis that we all get an equal share in it.
How would you propose that this be distributed?
Well, we're talking about establishing a special entity. We'd call it perhaps the National Credit Authority. They would calculate how much that profit is. They would then go about creating the credit, which governments have the right to create money. They hand it over to the banks, and people don't create money unless they're counterfeiting. Governments don't create it because you won't see it in their budgets. If they were creating money, they'd have it there to spend, but it's not there. They don't have it to spend. The only way they can get money that they haven't taken off us is to go into debt to the banking system. And in fact, the only way we get any money is by borrowing it from the banking system. It's well established now and has been understood well for 100 years that banks create our money system. They create all our money, they own it all, they rent it to us and demand it back with increase.
And as far as politics that is concerned, that pretty well determines the character of the party that's in, doesn't it?
Every time there's a budget, there's a carry on about whether the deficit should be there or what's the deficit. Australia has been in deficit every year since it existed as a nation. Since 1901, we became a nation. It's always been in deficit. By that I mean Australia's debt has increased every year. by a substantial amount. The government's debt doesn't always increase every year. They have had surpluses. But when they do, the private debt or the corporate debt has increased more than the government surplus. So we have never done anything except in deficit.
At the moment, a lot of the debt is being picked up by people taking on mortgages.
That's
Would
right.
you say?
The only way we can distribute the profit now is to go further into debt.
Yep.
And there are a whole range of ways that that's achieved. And one of them is housing. And I can tell you some stories about it, really. And a couple of little stories might help. Some decades ago in a small country town, a gentleman with a very generous nature won a few $100,000 in some sort of lottery. And in the same town at the same time, a fellow was transferred a few hundred miles. He decided he'd put it on auction and sell his furniture and buy more at the other end. So he advertised his furniture for sale, and all the friends and relatives of the fellow that run the lottery, they went to him and asked for some money so they could go and buy some furniture. And so they all got there and they bid against each other with his money. So they paid more than new prices.
Well, this is what happens at auctions, isn't it? Everyone rocks up with the bank's money.
That's right.
That they're perfectly willing to lend.
Yep.
And of course, prices go up depending on the bank's willingness to lend to them.
That's right. It's gone up to the extent...
So to what extent would you say then that the banks determine house prices?
Absolutely. Like, if you go back to, say, the 1950s, there'd be very few homes that would cost you more than $10,000. Those same homes now cost you $1 million.
So what would you say to this idea then that it's actually a shortage of supply?
Well, irrespective of supply, if you will lend this family $500,000 to buy that house, and you'd lend this family the same amount to buy that house, and another family, they go to auction, what's it going to bring? It's going to bring $500,000, isn't it? So, that's pretty much how it works. And it's got to the point now where 2/3 of all the money in existence has been created by banks and loaned to families to buy residential properties.
So it's a bit ironic then that the property which is supposed to set us free becomes the ball and chain.
That is right. If you go back to the 1950s, I can remember them, believe it or not, although I was very young. My mother used to wash clothes by rubbing them over a wooden board and boiling them in the copper in the backyard. And there was no vacuum cleaners, there were no mix masters, there wasn't even a refrigerator, there were ice chests. So when all that came after the Second World War, well, people thought, well, this is marvellous. For the first time, women are going to have a little bit of leisure. They'll be able to learn a language, read good books, have a bit of time to themselves, develop themselves in some way, learn to play a musical instrument, whatever it is. But that didn't happen. What happened was, for the banks, a single income families were a bad idea, because in the 50s, married women with children really didn't work. Very few of them did.
No.
But if you'd get them to work and you could have women's liberation and free them to work, then instead of a single income where that had to buy the food and pay for education and transport and a bit of entertainment and clothes and all those things, there wasn't much left over to pay a bank for a mortgage. But if you could get two incomes, the second income could be wholly going to the banks to pay the mortgage. So they loved that situation.
How did house prices react to this new development? I mean,
they just kept going up until it got so ridiculous that people don't see how they can cope with what they have to pay for a house now.
But this enormous mortgage, in an economy that requires debt to function, the enormous mortgage has become a necessity, hasn't it?
Yes, if you're not going to use that system, or if it comes to an end, you have to go to previous systems. Like one of the other systems that's historically been used is war. I remember John Kenneth Galbraith. He was quite a famous Keynesian economist in America. He was pointing out that the bloke that really stopped the Great Depression was not Keynes. It was a bloke called Adolf Hitler, because he just started spending money on war and kept spending it. And Germany became so prosperous in a few years, from say 1933, when 6 million German men didn't have a job, till when the war started, everybody had a job. They had,
well, that's where the Volkswagen came from.
That's right.
The Autobahns.
And he spent
Germans
all this
were going
money on
on
war,
holidays.
so you got the debt up. And by getting the debt up to the point where you can buy everything you're producing, you can operate. But you have to find a way to get that debt to grow.
Sure.
And there are many ways of increasing debt, and they're all essential. And the only alternative to debt is credit. The only alternative to a negative is a positive.
Absolutely, yeah. So do you want to explain that idea for us a bit? Because I don't think people understand that well, the process by which money is created.
Yeah. Well, perhaps one thing we might do is...
And just as it's remarkable to me that this thing, which is an absolute fact, is so little talked about.
Yeah.
I mean, we spend so much time in the media, well not we, but they spend so much time in the media talking about economics.
Yeah.
And the money system is always considered as like a neutral veil.
Yeah.
It's not worth talking about, it's just there, it just is what it is.
Yeah. Well, the truth of the matter is that after 1694, the creation of money in England became a private affair. The bloke that established the Bank of England, his name was William Paterson. He was a former pirate. And when he was promoting the bank to establish it, he said, this bank shall have the benefit of interest on all monies which it createth out of nothing. See, the government of England never created any money. It was all done by the Bank of England in association with the private banks. Now, in those days, they used to pretend that it was a gold standard. If they lend you some money, well, there's gold in the vault. If you had a pound note, well, you could go and get gold. And you could, but you couldn't get much of it. The whole gold standard was always a confidence trick. And there was never, in the history of the world on the gold standard, more than 1 or 2% of the money actually there in the form of gold. There's not much gold in the world.
Well, the gold thing makes no sense. The purpose of your money system is to facilitate the production and the distribution of goods.
That's right.
So how is that, in any natural way, correlated to how much of a rare metal you can dig out of the ground?
It's absolutely ludicrous. Warren Buffett and others have calculated how much gold has been produced since the beginning of mining by human beings, how much has been mined in our whole history. And if all the gold that's ever been mined, it will be a cube 20 metres in each direction. 20 metres long, 20 metres wide, 20 metres high. That's all the gold that's ever been produced since we began mining gold.
So what's the sense in hooking your quantity of money to that?
Well, it means that has to assume a value which is equal to all the earth, to all the land, to all the assets, all the homes, all the machines, all the know-how, all the technology. It's all got to be related to this block, which is 20 metres each direction.
I think Churchill apologised for taking England back to the gold standard.
Yes.
Is that right?
He did. They maintained the myth that it was all based on gold for as long as they possibly could. But it became totally and absolutely unworkable in 1931. And it can never go back to that. I mean, there never was more than 1 or 2% gold backing. When the First World War broke out, people thought, I better go and get me gold out. You never know what's going to happen. Within 2 days, the Bank of England had run out of gold. So what are we going to do now? There's only less than 2% of money withdrawn in gold, but the gold was all gone. It was never there. It was always a myth. So what do we do now? Well, Parliament declared 2 days bank holiday. Bank holiday for 2 days. The banks didn't open. And they wound up the printing presses and they printed these very flimsy, hurriedly produced banknotes. Basically said, well, this is a pound. And they took it in great bales and delivered it to all the banks. And when you go in to get your gold, they gave you a bit of paper. They'd left the gold standard overnight, printed these bits of paper. If you want your money, well, there it is, take it away. When you get sick of it, bring it back. And so they went off the gold standard, but the myth was dead. But they tried to reconstruct it, and Churchill was instrumental in reintroducing it, but he apologised for it because it just destroyed the place, and they had to get rid of it because Hitler didn't give a damn whether how much gold was where. He was just going to create money and go to war. So what are we going to do? Say, oh no, we can't afford to fight a war. There's not enough gold here or there or somewhere else. It's bloody nonsense.
Is that Shaq's banking miracle? Happens everywhere all the time.
Yeah, that's it. He just created money. Well, there's no other way to do it.
Yeah,
Somebody's got to do it.
Sure.
And we're not saying it shouldn't be done. It has to be done, and it has to be done in right measure. Like if you've got a theatre with 100 seats and the production's all organised, but there's only 70 tickets out there. What do? You've got to create another 30 tickets or you can't organise the thing. You can't consume what you've produced. So that's what has to happen. Somebody has to do it. We've let the banks do it, and then the 30 seats belong to them. Their value has to be repaid with interest. The other thing is, well, if we've all put on the show, the whole community has contributed to the production in the theatre, then we just print the extra tickets and hand them out.
There is enormous advantage on the part of the banks to keeping money short, because effectively money is the bank's product. And if you can keep it short, you drive the value of it up relative to the goods that people really want. If it is at the same level as prices on goods that people want, then it ceases to become a lever of power. Is that a fair?
Well, the Great Depression was built around trying to keep the value of money up. People can't believe that governments have given away the right to create money to private interests, and they monopolise it and they basically control it. They can't believe that governments would be that stupid.
But it's everywhere obvious that is the case.
Yes, it is.
I mean, it's almost like everything that governments do is about trying to shore up some money so that they can carry on the policies they want.
Yeah.
You know, it's education and health. We've got to tax more for that. You know, we can't possibly drive the national debt up anymore. It's going to be too unpopular, and it's not fiscally wise to do that, etc. I mean, the evidence that the governments don't create money is in every newspaper.
Yes, I think that's right.
You know, every day.
Yeah.
Nearly.
Yeah, that's right. They've got to get it from somewhere, and where are they going to get it from? And you hear these poor, sheepish politicians, every budget saying, where will the money come from? Where will the money come from? And, oh matey, I'll tell you, it comes from the bloody banks, and nowhere else but from the bloody banks, and it's that obvious.
Why? Perhaps it's not said in so many words.
Well,
I mean, is that the problem?
It's a big problem, and it's a problem that it's built into human nature, some of this. Richard Nixon said, and this is what sort of got me onto this, that the American people will never believe anything that they haven't seen on television. Now, he's not really talking about Americans, he's talking about everybody. And he's not really talking about television. What's really being said there is that most people are terrified about believing anything that a lot of other people don't apparently believe. If you think everybody else believes it, or most or enough other people believe it, you'll believe it. But if you don't have that, well, you don't have any confidence that you might be laughed at, and well, I don't want to be laughed at, and why does it matter to me? If nobody else believes it, we can't change it.
And I've wrestled with this a bit personally, that it's actually not polite to bring these things up.
It's true. The media will not, the media was forced to stop discussion of this type of thing. Because if you were a bank in this city and the newspapers in that city, you didn't control them in some way, have something over them, you know, they didn't have a mortgage or something, and they started talking like this, the opposition bank could put rubbish on the confidence in your bank, and that your bank would probably go down. So they pretty much had to have some control over what the media was saying.
Well, I think control of money and control of the media are concentric. I mean, it costs a lot to have a widely circulated paper, or
Yep.
or it's expensive to set up a television studio and have reporters, etc.,
Yeah.
etc. So how do you get that going if not?
I can remember, Rupert Murdoch's now a big magnet, but back when I was perhaps 30, somewhere there, he had about 100 banks that could have put him down because he borrowed money everywhere to build that empire. And any one of them could have said, well, I'm going to pull that in, and he would have gone down. The other banks were frightened that some one bank would do that, so they were all sort of telling each other to settle down, don't send him to the wall, because if he went to the wall, they'd probably all lose out. Just to reassure people, I'd like to read you a couple of sentences out of an official Bank of England document, which was their quarterly bulletin in 2014. And they said on their front page, whenever a bank makes a loan, it simultaneously creates a matching deposit in the borrower's bank account, thereby creating new money. Rather than banks receiving deposits when households save and then lending them out, bank lending creates deposits. See, nobody's deposit goes down to lend it to somebody else.
No.
I've yet to find anybody who's had his deposit reduced to lend it to somebody. In fact, that's illegal.
Yeah.
But so when they lend, somebody's got a bigger deposit and nobody's got a lesser deposit. So it's so obvious. Like, it's taken 100 years to convince people, but there's no argument at intelligent levels about banks creating credit. That's how it is. It's unarguable. Now,
so it is done. So creating credit is done. Money from nothing is done.
It's done. How else would you do
So
it?
the national dividend is actually, the actual mechanics of it isn't anything
Nothing new.
really new.
And
Something we've been doing for centuries.
We're not even creating any extra money. We just want to create it in a different way.
Sure.
Where instead of it being created as the property of banks, and therefore it's debt, it's created as the property of the shareholders, that is the citizens, and we get it debt-free. And it will still cancel out the costs of industry when we use it to buy consumer goods. So it's not inflationary. We're not creating any more money. Like in that year, 2014, which we quote as saying the American profit was 2.4 trillion. The total debt in America went up by 2.3 trillion. It wasn't all consumer debt, like credit cards and so on. Some of it was corporate debt, a lot of it was government debt, and applied to war and God knows what. But that's the sort of thing that has to happen. Debt has to go up, or we have to create the same amount of money and distribute it as a dividend. And that will give us all something of a basic income. That particular year, the dividend amounted to $7,500 per person and to $30,000 per family. Now that may not have been enough to survive on, at least in some areas, but it would have been a big help. I'm not saying that you could totally abolish all forms of social security with that, but it would go a hell of a long way towards it and make it easy for everybody. And nobody gets taxed at all to pay the national dividend, and nobody goes into debt for the national dividend.
And this is where it differs from the basic income idea, essentially,
right.
Isn't it?
That is right.
That it's not drawn from taxation, which comes from debt basically, as all money does at the moment.
Well, that is right. If government borrows, then that has to be paid in taxes. If the corporate world borrows, that has to be paid for in prices.
Yeah.
The consumer pays off all debt. And
it's important to note too that this is a system that is inherently inflationary. I mean, there's the economists are going to come out, the salaried economists will come out and say, oh, you can't do that, it's going to run the thing into hyperinflation, we're all going to be doomed to hell. But, if you pay for everything as debt, well, that is a cost that has to be recovered in prices later, and there's absolutely no way out of that.
It's cost push inflation.
So if you take the definition of inflation as an increase in the money supply associated with an increase in prices, then funding things with debt is the absolute definition of inflation.
Just cost push inflation.
Yeah.
But if you create the same amount of money, debt-free, so it doesn't have to go into the cost chain, it's the opposite of inflation. But everybody will...
Well, you're increasing the money supply and you don't have to increase prices accordingly.
No, when
Sure.
that money is spent, it liquidates costs in industry and with government if it goes into taxes or wherever. It abolishes debt. Therefore, it brings down the cost push. The big push for basic income is now coming about because of what they call the fourth industrial revolution.
What do they call it? Technological disruption, perhaps? Something like that. I've heard that term.
Well, what all the pundits are saying, that we're going to have 30 to 50% unemployment within just a few decades. And they're saying we need a basic income. Fine. Does that mean once we've got 50% unemployment, for every person that's employed, they will have to be paid enough, not only to support themselves, but to also support the other person that's not employed. So that's going to make employment expensive. So what do you think is going to happen to the push to eliminate human labour more and more?
Well, there's increased incentive to put people off.
That's right, that's right. And the more you pay the basic income, the more it's needed and the higher it has to be. And it just can't be financed. You know, people have got to get it in their heads that money is an enumerated abstraction. It's not anything except a claim upon others.
No.
And it can be a blip in a computer, a mark on a piece of paper, a printed note, a deposit in a bank, which is only there in a computer. You know, it's just a claim upon others. It's an IOU. It's an understanding that there's an IOU somewhere. And you can give the whole of society and the whole direction of society to some banking cartel, or you can let society make up its own mind how it's going to develop by empowering each person to the extent that they hold a share in the country.
Well, it's been likened to a sort of economic vote.
Yeah, that's right.
Which I think is quite a good analogy. You know,
Yeah.
like we get some decision about the political direction of the country with our vote at the ballot box.
Yeah.
And likewise, we can be given some say in the economic direction if we have sufficient votes.
Now, if
Economic vote.
we organise the political vote in the same way we organise the economic vote, we would say, okay, here's your ballot paper, have a vote, but you've got to give us that vote back with an increase at the end of another year. You know, ballot papers, they're not given unconditionally, they're given on the basis that you give them back. So how bloody mad is that? It's only an expression of choice, really. That's what the dollar is.
Yeah.
It's an expression of choice about how you want industry and society to serve you, to the extent that you've got a just right to claim that. And if you've got a backbone and breathe, you've got a right to a national dividend. An equal right, that's, I think, the fairest way. Some will contribute more, some will contribute less, but we're all shareholders in the country, so right. The rich get it, the poor get it, the blind get it, the deaf get it, everybody gets it. And it's not a conditional thing, there's no means test, there's an absolute right. Doesn't matter whether you got $50 billion, you're going to have the bloody national dividend sent to you because it's your right and you've got a share in this country. And if he's got an absolute right to it, so has every other poor person got the same right. So it's an absolute thing. We want to make it that way. And we fund it without debt, without tyranny, without trying to direct the bloody human organism. And there are so many other implications. We perhaps explore some of them. I mean, one of the ways they try to keep debt going up is with immigration. And this gets totally out of hand. The good thing about immigrants is they generally come into the country very often with nothing. The people that are already, for instance, in the country may have about this much debt, you know, and can't afford too much. If we bring people in with nothing, that's one thing. They can borrow more money and get the debt overall going up. But more than that, you can set everybody working. You can get them working to build them homes, to build schools, to build infrastructure.
Well, I heard that, for example, I think 80% of immigrants went into Melbourne, something like that. Of new immigrants went into Melbourne. So can you imagine, and I don't know the exact figures, but there's a couple of 100,000 of them a year.
Yeah.
So that puts enormous pressure on existing infrastructure, which needs to be updated and
Well, it's got to the
in order to
point.
take that strain.
It's so desperate. Some countries are so desperate to get immigrants, like for instance Holland. They've accepted immigrants in there to the point, within 20 years, the Dutch are going to be in a minority in Holland. And they can't stop. They can't continue to be Dutch. They must become Middle Eastern or whatever they are, whatever's available. They didn't set out to become Middle Eastern or Muslim or anything like that. They just set out, we've got to get the debt to increase. Therefore, we need immigrations. We need growth and jobs. So we have lots of immigrants, lots of growth, lots of jobs. And if you end up a stranger in your own country, too bloody bad.
That's not the priority.
The only alternative is a national dividend.
Yeah.
And they're not prepared to look at it. And the newspapers won't carry the idea. This is going to have to be an internet carried virus. We're going to have to do it through that.
Why is it not considered? I mean, it's been around for a long time. It's been around for 100 years plus. So why is it not considered, a feasible way out of our entanglements?
Well, it is considered feasible. It is considered highly logical. It is considered the best and most sensible alternative of the whole lot. But that's never going to be relevant unless it appears on television. Because we don't have the confidence, no matter how logical it is, no matter how sensible it is. Human beings cannot believe anything, or in the main, they're not going to believe anything unless they're convinced that a lot of other people believe it.
Are you
and if it's not on television, other people can't believe it.
Are you convinced that if a critical mass of people understood this thing, that we would have it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. As Henry Ford said, if people understood this confidence trick, which is banking, of creating all money and keeping it, there'd be a riot next morning. It'd be overcome immediately. But by not talking about it, that's why they have to control the media, why it has to be concentric. If we understood it, we'd end it. We'd change it. And I think we can do that, but it's going to take a long time. It's taken 100 years to convince people that banks create all our money.
And most people aren't convinced of that.
No, but it's unarguable.
Sure.
And like when you get down to really arguing it.
But there's a difference between accepted fact and it being widely disseminated.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely.
Like,
they don't want to talk about it.
And that's the critical difference, I feel.
Yeah, it is. Nobody tries to argue it when you get to argue it, but they give it the silent treatment, and therefore people don't understand the significance of it and what it could mean to change our lives. We all live these stress-filled lives we might lose our job and we got a big mortgage and we don't have as many children as we'd like to have because it's too damned expensive and so on it goes, and we're all carrying on like that.
And this is the awful thing about it. You say it's an enumerated abstraction, but it does enormous social damage. It does enormous damage to families and to people's mental conditions and so forth. I mean, so many of the things you hear about, people's mental health declining and so forth, you can bring back to this financial
Very
strain.
often.
I mean, it puts people under enormous strain. And a small national dividend, something that was secure, could just take the tension out of it for a lot of people. They can just say, all right, I can rely on this thing.
That's right. And it would end recessions and booms for bloody ever. Because this is the amount of money we're short of to consume what we've produced. Well, there it is and it's available. Not more than that and not less than that.
Remember, was it 2007 where Rudd gave everybody the $700 or whatever?
Like
I mean, the sky didn't fall in.
No, we didn't all rush out and desert our jobs and live it up down the beach. It used to be, you couldn't have a national dividend because people would just go mad and they'd become indulgent and they'd stop working and all this sort of stuff. It's not there.
But I feel that's misunderstanding of history, actually.
Yeah, it
I mean,
is.
people associated for the common good to get things done before there was a money system that forced them to do it.
Yes.
You know, people grew their food and dealt with their rubbish and
They traded
built houses and so
traded
forth.
their surpluses. You know, somebody was
Absolutely.
good at making arrowheads, he'd trade them for somebody that was good at hunting rabbits, and
Yeah.
it's just an aid to cooperation. That's what the function of money is, to aid our economic cooperation with each other.
And you know, it's absolutely, well, I feel that it's intolerable because it's become an irresponsible government. I mean, the government is not as much what we call the government in Parliament is not as much a government as the money system which compels us to do things that we ordinarily wouldn't do.
As Gladstone, the one-time Prime Minister of England, said, in substantive matters of money, the government doesn't play a role. It's made clear to me that we're supposed to stay out of it, and it's the banks that govern in that sense. So they've abdicated. They've completely abdicated. I'll tell you a story. I mean, it's about that happened in this country. There was a fellow that came to this country. His name was King O'Malley. He jumped on a ship because he thought he was dying of tuberculosis. And he came from America or Canada or something, and he landed here in Queensland, got himself into a cave. I think an Aboriginal local helped him survive for a while. He got over it. And there's a whole story there, but he advocated for many years the establishment of a People's Bank. And eventually he succeeded in getting the Labor Party of the day to accept that. It was started with £10,000 in 1910. And within 4 years, it took over the whole of the financing of the First World War, when 10% of Australians went overseas in uniform. An unbelievable, never been equalled by any other nation. And the Commonwealth Bank charged 0.5% interest rate, and they made a profit. See, money is cheap to make, and you don't need much to start with. If you've got £10,000, you can create multiple millions. So, in the profit out of the note issue, they built the Transcontinental Railway. So that really cost the taxpayer nothing. But by the 1920s, politicians are irresponsible. They will not do a decent set of books. Every company director insists we want a decent balance sheet, we want a profit and loss account. No politician will have a bar of it. So they don't even know what their bloody assets are or their liabilities are. And a new government came in. It was called the Bruce Page government because it was a two-party thing. One leader was Bruce and the other one was Page. And they took the control of the Commonwealth Bank out of the hands of a governor, a single person who's totally personally responsible, and they put it under a board of directors. Now, where do you get people that are experienced in banking? You get them from the private banks. So the private banks personnel was invited in, put on the board, and from that day to this, we've never got any interest as low as 0.5%, and the bloody mint has been making notes at a loss for many of those years. And back, I can't exactly say when, but a federal parliamentarian told me that the question was once asked in the House, how much do banks pay for banknotes? And the answer was 2 shillings per dozen, irrespective of denomination.
That's a good deal, isn't it?
It is a good deal. See, the banks, until the First World War, they all printed their own banknotes. You could go to the museum. As a boy, I saw them there, the old museum near the exhibition ground. And there were Bank of New South Wales and there were Commercial Bank of Sydney notes, and they were all there. But in that period, they got the government to create one note for everybody, but they expected to buy them just for the cost of printing them. And sometimes they were getting them for less than the cost of printing them. So not only do they create all the credit, they really get all the notes for nothing except the price of printing them. So they're on a hell of a good deal, and they are... What can a government do when they won't take responsibility for something as fundamental as that?
Well, I mean, is it even... can the government just refuse to govern in certain aspects? I mean, it's possibly the most critical aspect of governing. I mean, how do you run an economy
Well,
without a reliable supply of money,
Yeah.
where you have to constantly appeal to bankers for the right to govern?
that was answered by President Lincoln. See, President Lincoln actually created the notes, the greenbacks. And 6 weeks before he was assassinated, he made a speech. It's recorded in their Senate records. This is in 1865, and I'll read you a couple of sentences. He said, the government should create, issue and circulate all the currency and credit needed to satisfy the spending power of the government and the buying power of consumers. The privilege of creating and issuing money is not only the supreme prerogative of government, but it is the government's greatest creative opportunity. Money will cease to be the master and become the servant of humanity. Democracy will rise superior to the money power. That's in document 23, page 91 of the Senate document of 1865. And who knows, I mean, he didn't live long after making that statement. And the implications are really pretty enormous. I tell you, this might be drawing a long bow. And well, laugh at me if you'd like. I might laugh at myself. I mean, it's drawing a long bow. In 1694, private entities got the right to create all the money in England. They used it to finance the British Commonwealth, British Empire, the Industrial Revolution. They had a lot of experience by about that period when Lincoln was talking. And I think there was a rising understanding that we should be reconsidering this. Lincoln was onto it.
I think Jefferson said similar things.
That's right. So, this is a long bow, but my own view is that the people that created credit decided that they could do with a very big red herring to draw across public discussion. A decoy, if you like. And so they promoted the idea that the big problem in the world was capital. And the answer to capital was socialism. So we had about 150 years there. The big issue was capital and socialism. But capital was never king. What is it that commands capital? What is it that acquires the capital or doesn't acquire it? Directs it, owns it, disposes of it, orders it about? It's credit. Credit was the key. That was the issue. If we focused on the credit, we'd have been able to sort this thing through. So therefore, it's rather interesting. I saw something just the other day. From 1852 to 1862, Karl Marx was published in the capitalist newspapers around the world. The New York Tribune, which was the biggest circulating Sunday paper in North America, there is on record 500 articles that Karl Marx wrote in those years and sent to them. And he was a paid correspondent. They were publishing a couple of articles every week, very often. So why did capital suddenly get a great deal of interest in promoting communism? Well, the answer was you've got to have some distraction. The critical thing is credit. If you can promote a fight, you know what it's like. If you want to take attention away from what's happening at this end of the street, get a couple of blokes to start a brawl down the other end. And we'll all run down there and gawk at that and probably take sides and say, I'm for Harry and I'm for Bill. It was all bloody irrelevant. It was all bloody nonsense. The whole bloody thing was rubbish. The issue was credit, the control of credit. And it was in private hands, and to keep it in private hands, you had all this nonsense about whether property should be private or public and all that. So this is, I mean, it's drawing a long bow, but it does make you wonder. It's been bloody effective.
I've felt for a long time that the left-right thing is a false paradigm.
Yeah.
I mean, the absolute outcome of both of them is very similar.
Yes.
And in fact, a lot of those communist countries that fell over, they converted to capitalism, no problems. Because the thing, it's basically the same sort of thing. You get an oligarchy that maintains central control.
Well, sort of the Nazi thing, you know, it was really pure capitalism. All the industry was controlled privately,
Yeah.
and that worked quite well for them. They were both totalitarian. You didn't get any bloody say no matter which system you're in. But so what difference does it bloody make whether the government has titular ownership or whether some enormous public companies have the same with the backing of banks, of course. It doesn't make much difference to the individual. The only way we can break this is empower people with an inalienable right to money when it's created. When it's created, well, after it's created, well, we traded this to this and so on and so on. But when it's created, if we don't own it, we don't own anything.